Buenos días, compadres y necochans, muy valides de la revolución. Happy Black History, Ancient Futures Month. I'm super excited to be back with y'all to talk about abolition. This video is going to be a practical guide for how to replace police and prisons. I will not be spending a lot of time explaining to you why I think this is a necessary premise, so I will assume that your power level is at defund the police or higher coming into this video. Additionally, normally this would be the place where I would plug my PayPal or something like this, but in the spirit of mutual aid, today I would like to promote a project that I have been working on with an incarcerated comrade, Uhuru Akim Shakur, called Outcast People Nation, which is a giving circle for LGBT incarcerated folks. Your money just goes directly to them. I just spend some time sending it to them, coordinating that. So please check out the link in the description. The overwhelming majority of the folks supported are Black. So yeah, I hope you'll check that out and I hope you'll enjoy this video. Let's switch to the drawing cam.
Bum, bum, bum. As a Black person in America, would you see the police? Say a little prayer to the shepherd who let wolves guard the sheep. Who police the police? Who police the police? Who police the police when they get out of line? Who police the police? Who police the police? Who police the police when they get out of line? We gon' have to kill somebody to get this revolution started.
Yeah, bro. Hey folks, I realized that the easiest way to get around the copyright restrictions on YouTube is just to overlay my own voice, so I apologize for my out-of-tune transsexual yowling. Yeah, so as I kind of said in the introduction, like, I really don't want to justify my premise too hard. Like, at this point, you should already know that the police are slave catchers, Indian agents, and mob enforcers. I will list some resources in the description if you don't already know that will go into it in a lot more depth. In particular, I really recommend Christian Williams' book, Our Enemies in Blue. I also want to state that for most people of color, this information does not have to be told to us. Speaking for myself alone, as an extremely light-skinned person of African descent, I have had quite a number of negative experiences with police, including several where I honestly thought that I might die. So, you know, I just think that, like, even to be a stranger to this information is a form of privilege that people should keep in mind. But just to kind of like set up the premise, the main function of policing is to exercise the state's monopoly on violence internally. Basically what that means is that, you know, as part of the formation of state-based societies, there's supposedly this idea of a social contract, and part of that social contract is that citizens lose the ability to exercise violence on an individual basis, as compared to, say, societies that are based on retribution as their primary form of justice. And so in a state-based society, the government exercises a monopoly on violence, and the police are the arm of that monopoly on violence. One of the interesting ways that we see this break down, that some old raccoon was talking about in a video that I'll link below, is that, you know, we see that when people do take back the right to violence, it's often declared as unlawful. Such as, for example, when Black people riot against the police, or as Zizek was talking about, when Palestinian people retaliate against Israeli civilians. But these situations show that disenfranchised folks often do not have the right to exercise violence, but in fact that when they exercise this kind of what he calls divine violence, based on the writings of Walter Benjamin, that this divine violence of the citizenry kind of like taking their revenge takes place against a backdrop of state violence, which is not visible and not acknowledged. Frantz Fanon talks about this as well. I know this is the cardinal sin of quoting the wretched of the earth, but not only referring to the first essay, but in On Violence, he says, quote, "The colonized have been prepared for violence from time immemorial. As soon as they are born, it is obvious to them that their cramped world, riddled with taboos, can only be challenged by out-and-out violence." He also describes how this psychology begins to turn on itself, such as in the phenomenon of black-on-black violence that we talk about in the United States. He says again, quote, "Whereas the colonist or the police officer can beat the colonized subject day in and day out, insult them and shove them to their knees, it is not uncommon to see the colonized subject draw their knife at the slightest hostile or aggressive look from another colonized subject." So we want to think about how we can take back our own power and use it for ways that serve us rather than ways that continue to perpetuate our harms. As a small exercise here, I would love for you to pause the video and just take a second and write down, in your opinion, what you think everything is that the police do and don't do. Go ahead and actually take a few seconds here. So I don't know what you wrote down. I would say that from my perspective, what police do primarily is protect the status quo and personal property, private property rather. This mostly has to do with enforcement of property offenses and what are called quality of life offenses. These tend to be crimes or offenses rather that punish people, for example, for being unhoused or for being poor, such as prohibitions on peeing in public or sleeping in public, or in some places even eating in public. Sorry, a little dog groan there. So we see that, the police are primarily concerned with maintaining a sense of public order rather than necessarily protecting people. They're also highly over-deployed for issues that have to do with mental health and poverty. For example, half of the people killed by police are disabled. Police are also responsible for marking out the boundaries of political discourse. What this means is that they essentially decide what protests are and are not legal, not based on the behavior of the protesters, in fact, but based on the content of the protest. So you can see this by a distinction between the treatment of Black and Indigenous folks versus the treatment of white supremacists. Right now, in the colonial hellscape that I live in, also known as Canada, there are a great number of white supremacists engaged in disruption of the public order, ostensibly because they don't like vaccines, but it's been revealed that many of the organizers are in fact out and out white supremacists, and they kind of have told on themselves in that way. But the interesting thing about that is, if you compare what's going on now in early 2022 with what was happening in the summer of 2020 in the US, as well as in the very early months of 2020 out here in solidarity with Wet'suwet'en, you can see that the police are much more willing to allow white supremacists to protest than they are willing to allow Black and Indigenous people to protest, regardless of the peacefulness of our protests compared to the disruption of the white supremacist protests. I'm reminded of a very iconic image from the Ferguson protests featuring an individual holding up a mirror that states, if you want to see who came to riot, look who dressed for riot, revealing that it is in fact the police who were prepared to riot and not the people who were simply protesting another senseless killing. Another example of this that Williams describes in Our Enemies in Blue is the 1969 Democratic National Convention, in which again the police showed up and caused a riot when there was otherwise a peaceful protest, and in fact the police warned some of the journalists whom they were on good terms with that they would be violently attacking the crowd and ask them to leave if they wanted to be safe. Another thing we need to talk about is what the police don't do. One of the largest issues is that the police actually are not here to protect the average person unless you are some rich white person. In particular, police especially are not interested in addressing sexual violence. Our so-called justice system is not at all set up to address these kinds of issues in any kind of fair or responsible way. I think this is the inherent hypocrisy of the most common claim that is held up against abolitionists, which is, what will we do with the rapists? As a matter of fact, nothing at all is being done with rapists and sexual abusers under our current system. Rape and sexual assault are the most underreported crimes in the United States. Only about 6% of rapists will ever serve a single day in jail. Only 0.07% of rapes end in a felony conviction. As Angel Parker wrote in What About the Rapists and Murderers, this fact speaks to why she responds, what are we doing with them now, when asked, what about the rapists? Because the answer is essentially nothing. In fact, there are many more survivors of rape and sexual assault in prison than there are rapists themselves who are incarcerated. And again, this idea of like, what will we do with the rapists, and just generally like reacting to the desire for abolition with, basically justifications for prisons, pushes the idea that incarcerated people are inherently bad, predisposed to violence, whereas in fact the pigs are the rapists and the murderers, and they have carte blanche to do so. One really shocking statistic to me is that while 50% of police misconduct allegations are of sexual assault, a full 50% of those, which is to say 25% of police sexual misconduct allegations, are allegations of sexual assaults of minors. So clearly the police are perpetrating much more violence than they are actually choosing to stop. So when we talk about abolition and really break this down, is part of this anarchist concept called dual power, which is essentially the way that anarchist praxis is based on both resisting the state as well as creating sets of alternative democratic and community-based institutions that resist the power of the state by replacing it, by rendering it unnecessary, because one of the state's major claims to authority is that we need it, that they're providing us with something. But when we see, first of all, that they're actually not providing us with the things that they claim to be doing, as well as that we can in fact replace them, we show that anarchism is viable to people. And it's kind of like what Emma Goldman called the propaganda of the deed, which is to say, like, just doing the thing itself and showing how by doing it you can convince people to come to our side. So in the case of police abolition, dual power would be building up our own structures of protection, accountability, and defense as a viable alternative to what already exists, declaring our independence from the structures of power. As Andrea Smith says in Decolonizing Anti-Rape Law, the project of prison abolition is a positive rather than a negative one. We have to engage in what Angela Davis calls abolition democracy, which is the creation of a set of alternative institutions that make police and prisons obsolete. So you may ask, how do you do that? In general, we need to focus on community-based approaches, using restorative justice processes to humanize both victims and perpetrators of crime and come to a resolution that meets the needs of everyone involved. Restorative justice rejects a system of justice predicated on punishment, instead seeking to build strong interpersonal relationships. Restorative justice also requires the community to be involved in the process and to rebuild in the wake of harm. Fundamental to restorative justice projects is the belief that community accountability is not simply a contemporary phenomenon, but reflects everyday ways of thinking and doing that have been practiced within communities for generations. I think also we should address the concerns of disabled folks, because I think when we start to talk about, like self-defense, community accountability, some folks who may not have the physical ability to defend themselves may become concerned. But again, we're not trying to create this kind of like eye for an eye sort of justice system, which is not a pure, individualist libertarian kind of ideology, but the idea that the community should band together to create processes that incorporate each other's strengths and cover each other's weaknesses. As Marx famously stated in his critique of the Gotha program, from each according to their ability and to each according to their needs. Also, right at the offset, I should just flag some security risks and some considerations in trying to do this stuff. Don't try to be Rambo. Don't intervene in dangerous situations unless you outnumber the aggressors. And don't try to go out of your way to draw state attention. Unfortunately, if these kinds of projects become successful, the police will try to intervene and reinforce their monopoly on violence. But, if you're able to fly under the radar for the most part, you can still do really good work without drawing too much attention from the state. So this framework that I'm going to be talking about is loosely based on the Australian organization Pechang Nonviolent Community Safety Group, which is based on their Nonviolent Community Safety and Peacebuilding Handbook. Link will be in the bleep loop. So basically they think about it as a three-part system involving peace building, peacekeeping, and peacemaking. So peace building is changing community culture to affect the underlying conditions which allowed or caused conflict or violence to occur in the first place. This means addressing root cultural issues such as a lack of care for one another, a lack of sense of community, and a lack of value for one another. This is, again, what Angela Davis calls abolition democracy. So, as she states, a police abolition and decarceration approach has to envision a continuum of alternatives to imprisonment. This requires demilitarization of schools, revitalization of education at all levels, a health system that provides free physical and mental care to all, and a justice system based on reparation and reconciliation rather than retribution and vengeance. So peace building involves providing a lot of services and support. And I should be careful to say that this does not simply mean reinforcing the so-called social services that we currently have, because a lot of them report to police, engage with police in many ways, and some of them, even if they don't report to police necessarily, are inherently carceral themselves, such as the so-called child protective services, or rather what Dorothy Roberts calls the family regulation system, as well as mental health institutions and therapists, which, in fairness, are legally required to report to police in certain situations. There's a project created by Mariam Kaba called 1 Million Experiments, which catalogs a bunch of community-level interventions to address policing, some of which are simply alternatives to calling 911, where community members will respond instead, some of which are mental health services, and some of which are simply free food and mutual aid projects. All of these kinds of projects are part of rebuilding community and growing people's confidence that things can be addressed locally. Mia Mingus has created this excellent worksheet called the Pods and Pod Mapping Worksheet, which helps folks kind of map out like who in your local community would you actually speak to if you had a problem that needed addressing, and how would they be able to respond. And I strongly encourage you to go through it for your own personal life and address it. I would just say, I've had an experience with some folks in my own local community, an older white lady, let's call her Rose. So Rose and her partner, at the time, I was hanging out with them and they were talking about certain incidents that had taken place. And I just sort of casually said to them, I'm undocumented here and I feel really unsafe when police are around. So if anything happens, please just call me instead of the police. If you have an emergency, I'm happy to come and crack some skulls or whatever needs to happen. And it was quite interesting because both Rose herself, her former partner, as well as the current partner that she was with at the time, had been police officers. In fact, they had been RCMP officers, which For those who live in Canada, you already know that that's basically a combination of a police officer and an FBI agent and a sheriff all rolled into one. Basically, the most horrible possible version. But interestingly enough, when Rose and her then partner were no longer together, and in fact it escalated to the point where he was causing her to feel unsafe, she did indeed call me and she said, "Hey, I feel really unsafe. Normally I would call the police and try to get a restraining order, but I know you asked me not to do that, so what should I do?" And I said, "Look, I'm gonna walk by your house 3 times a day. You can call me if anything goes wrong, and we'll just round up folks in the neighborhood and hold your space if you feel like this guy is coming around trying to harass you." And I think what this shows is that people actually want to feel cared for by the people around them. And if you provide the opportunity for that to happen, they will happily not involve strangers, such as the police, who often make the situation worse. However, one thing that's important to remark, as I mentioned as well in my What is Nature video, is that it's very important to not define the community in exclusionary or segregationist ways. Again, many of our communities are formed to enforce segregation. And so, we don't just want to replicate white people neighborhood watches that are just going to freak out every time they see a brown person come into the neighborhood. That's not the point. The point is that we're actually reaching out to unhoused folks, we're reaching out to indigenous folks, we're reaching out to nearby communities that may be of different income levels or different cultures, and including them in these projects that we're doing, rather than just, banding together with folks of similar privilege and skin color. So after peace building, which is sort of the foundation that should be ongoing at all times, we have peacekeeping, which is basically conflict prevention. This involves, just basic not getting your shit stolen protocols, like locking your doors, keeping things out of sight in your car, things like that, just not providing opportunities for opportunistic crimes, I guess. It also includes nonviolent strategies for intervention, such as surrounding the aggressor, holding a space. There's some really cool projects done by some women's organizations that involved, addressing domestic abuse simply by, 15 or 20 people showing up to the apartment where the fight is taking place and just refusing to leave until either the aggressor leaves or until the situation feels fully de-escalated, or if they're able to remove the person who is experiencing abuse. The cool thing about peacekeeping is that anyone can participate because it's based on cooperative and open power with principles rather than forceful, coercive, discriminatory, or violent power over, which is used by police and private security. The Pachang Manual advises that peacekeepers should look for creative ways of isolating and calming aggressive people by building positive relationships with them. For example, through statements like, "I'd like to listen to you, but I'm having trouble because you're shouting." This paradigm recognizes that peacekeeping is actually about emotional skills and not shows of force. Sarah Safai says, in Policing Aboriginality and Aboriginal Community Policing, peacekeeping is the work of relationships, which is both temporal and pastoral work and is a form of cultural labor. So other forms of peacekeeping involve, protecting vulnerable people and traveling information. There's a really cool resource by Vision Fight Win for how to do this during protests. But basically, because fascist violence in particular tends to take place when fascists feel like they have a numerical or physical advantage because they're fucking cowards, simply asserting a presence through patrols or shows of solidarity can delineate spaces as unhospitable to fascist participation or intimidation. A similar approach was used by East Harlem neighborhood watches, which go into houses, like I said, where domestic violence has taken place to prevent further violence, as well as women's street protection groups who would meet up with individuals who were working late at night, for example, and didn't feel safe walking home. And they would simply just be a group of 5 other women and queer folks who would just come around and state, that they were there to walk you home. And, just having those strength in numbers will usually deter most kinds of violence. And of course, as part of peacekeeping, self and community defense are included, but often as a last resort when totally justified. And in the similar vein to anti-fascist clashes with fascist aggressors, the spontaneity of the self-defense ensures that no individual or group holds power and that the violence is temporary and doesn't represent a formalized hierarchy. Finally, once a harm has occurred, we have to move into peacemaking. This is the search for a negotiated settlement between the parties using restorative justice techniques. This is a survivor-led process that is designed to create accountability to the community rather than punishment. Helping survivors is really not part of our current quote-unquote justice practices. Oftentimes, even in the criminal court proceedings, when survivors are included, they are often just kind of like as a witness for the prosecution rather than the actual driver of why these processes are actually taking place. When we're creating our own systems, we have to attend to survivors as individuals. That means first we have to ensure that they're physically safe, and then we have to ensure that they're genuinely willing participants in whatever restorative processes may take place. It can be difficult sometimes to tell if survivors are consenting to participate in these processes. Survivors can be coerced by the community, particularly in Black, First Nations, or other marginalized communities where there's a commitment to protecting perpetrators from colonial justice systems. However, restorative processes can be more healing for survivors. By engaging in healing rather than punitive processes, survivors can break the trauma bond between them and their perpetrators, allowing them to stop carrying the guilt and shame that are properly the perpetrators. The key is to ensure that those processes are supportive, first and foremost, of the survivors. For example, South African rape courts are designed to be dedicated solely to sexual assault crimes, with specialized prosecutors and judges trained to provide victim-centered justice. Analogously, Sarah Deer envisions rape courts in First Nations communities in which women elders in the community gather to respond to the report of a sexual assault. This would reintegrate clan and family values into the peacemaking process and would empower survivors and lessen their isolation and shame. Peacemaking also involves therapeutic approaches, which means seeing perpetrators as humans who are redeemable and who very likely have been victims themselves in their lives. For example, Tricia Bent Goodley and Chantel Smith envision an Afrocentric juvenile justice paradigm which has a holistic response, uses family and community, and focuses on empowerment, building life skills, and emphasizing the use of cultural knowledge in addressing issues caused by Black youth. Mariam Kaba gives the example of responding to having a youth steal something for her purse, and in so doing, she reminds us that, quote, most of what happens to us is happening in relationship. The young people in our community are in relationship with us, whether we know that or not. One of the most well-developed examples of restorative justice that I've come across is the 4 circles of hollow water. This is from the Hollow Water Anishinaabe community from northern Manitoba. And essentially, this structure is a series of therapeutic circles led by trained therapists and elders, which first separately meet with the perpetrator and the victim of sexual assault or domestic violence. And at first, basically, they just continue meeting individually with these 2 folks until they both feel ready to move on. And then they will bring in those individuals, the perpetrator and the victim's trusted family members or friends, into the therapeutic circle and talk with them about what's happened, why it's happened, all of this sort of stuff. And then after a certain point, again, when everyone involved feels like they're ready to continue, and only with the explicit consent of the victim, they will create a circle which involves the perpetrator, the victim, both of their trusted loved ones, to chat through basically what's gone on and what kind of restoration feels necessary. And then finally, there will be a circle with the entire community where the community can actually address how this harm has taken place both in context of harm to the entire community, such as in the context of colonial violence, colonial sexual violence, residential schools, etc., as well as addressing how the community has been harmed by this event and how the perpetrator will make reparation not just to the survivor but to the community as a whole. Again, this process does not move forward unless each party consents to moving to the next step. Otherwise, they continue to repeat the steps that they are at indefinitely. One of the interesting things about this is that Hollow Waters practitioners link their low rates of recidivism to their embodiment of an Anishinaabe ethic of justice. In pre-contact Anishinaabe communities, social cohesion was based on the common central value of Bimadijuin, or the good life. This incredibly broad concept embraces a variety of aspects, but for our purposes, we will just say that it's an ethic of relationship to land and other beings. At Hollow Water, this ethic underpins the goal of rehabilitating both survivors and perpetrators of sexual violence. As I said, the process begins with community members investigating allegations of sexual assault, often because police don't care to investigate. And then once the investigation is complete, the members go to the perpetrator's house and ask them to acknowledge the abuse, refusing to leave until they do, and then they progress through the circles that I described. But it's really interesting that they require an admission of guilt because oftentimes, individuals who are placed in a punitive structure are not willing to admit guilt even when something really has taken place, but by requiring the admission of guilt inside of a framework that doesn't place blame, the perpetrator has the opportunity to move past what they've done and take accountability rather than simply be stuck in that defensive mindset. As I mentioned, throughout the process, both the perpetrator and the victim are provided with counseling. Additionally, a group of former perpetrators meets regularly to challenge their own attitudes and to maintain accountability. On top of this, perpetrators are required to do work to reintegrate themselves into the community through community service and gift giving. As team member Burma Bushi notes, this process is significantly more difficult than incarceration. These are the hardest things to do, to face their own families, their families of origin, their community members, and their victims. The easy thing to do is just deny everything and go sit in jail for a couple of months. And yet, perpetrators voluntarily engage in this process because it's a process that recognizes their humanity and their capacity for change and emerges from an Anishinaabe ethic and from a recognition of Anishinaabe cultural values and history. This once again emphasizes the importance of placing accountability in a cultural framework. For example, Ana Clarisa Rojas Durazo notes that many of the community safety projects she's engaged in have had as one of their core concepts La Mirada, or the gaze, which is present in many Latinx cultures. She says that La Mirada contains a hint of I'm watching you and community accountability, the sense that someone is looking out for you and making sure that you're doing right. So again, this re-emphasizes that peacemaking is not about shaming and call-outs, but a process of transformation and reintegration. Finally, if the perpetrator is not cooperative, ostracism is a final resort. But in the context of a tightly knit community where the kind of peace building has been formed to have real unity, this would actually have real consequences. Unlike now, where many people who are involved in activist circles can report that abusers simply jump from city to city where their reputation has been tarnished and then they go somewhere else where they can simply continue to perpetrate abuse. The organization Insight, Women of Color Against Violence, states that if the abuser fails to take accountability, their approach anticipates further consequences like asking them to leave the community or public disclosure of the abuse, including to people outside the community and to potential employers. But again, this is not simply cancel culture, because what is also part of this is that individuals have made a conscious effort to reintegrate these folks into the community, and the healing and therapy has been provided throughout to the victims, regardless of what the perpetrators have done. We should stop and talk a little bit about some limitations and just kind of general advice to these approaches. The first thing is that these processes build on each other. You have to have a community first and then be able to hold space to prevent ongoing violence, and only then can you repair. Everything here requires a high level of community buy-in, which is a pretty major drawback. But to my knowledge, this just means that, again, it's better to fixate on small scale approaches. If you just say, like, you know, me and my 5 households of homies are going to employ this approach, again, because most violence is perpetrated within, you know, close personal circles, you can slowly start to build outwards. Additionally, as I said before, you know, don't deliberately put yourself in a dangerous situation if you don't have a numerical advantage, or if you have someone, you know, in the hellscape known as America, like an active shooter. Sometimes the safest thing to do is just flee or hide. There's nothing wrong with that. And then again, as I said, once these processes grow to a certain size, police and other structures may try to fight back. For example, all the Black Panther Party was trying to do was feed and protect their communities, and, you know, we got COINTELPRO, and now the overwhelming majority of the activists of that time period are either incarcerated, in exile, or dead. I also want to state as a disclaimer that I do not necessarily endorse armed revolt against the state. If you do that, only do it in Minecraft. All right, let's do ourselves a little conclusion. I have to say, even from my high school essay writing days, I really hated to do the kind of pat summarizing conclusion. I think folks are intelligent and can draw their own conclusions. And so for that reason, I would like to invite you to participate in an activity from Cosmic Possibilities, a youth guide to abolition created by Project NIA, and I'll post the whole workbook in the description, of course. But the exercise is the following. Imagine your community without police and without prisons, as a place where folks are held and safe. What does that community look like? What would have to change? What would be good about that community? What would some of the challenges be? So this artwork, as you can see, is my attempt to answer in part those questions, but I really do encourage you to think of your own approaches. One of the core anarchist principles that I really love, I believe I quoted this in a previous video, is embodied by the Zapatistas, where they say, we want a world where many worlds fit. And what that means is everyone should create the abolition in their community that suits their community, and just build and grow from there. I believe in you, comrades. I know that you can do it. I know that you can create a world where we make police and prisons obsolete. Yebo.
سجن فيه وردة على بابه فيه سجان كل السجون واحدة وده سجن بالألوان 4 حيطان من نور بتبارك العصيان ليه طيور بتهج وتصاحب الغضبان في سجن في وردة على بابه في سجان كل السجون واحدة وده سجن بالألوان 4 حيطان من نور بتبارك العصيان بتطير بتحج وتصاحب الغضبان لن تحبسوا وردة لا دولة العميان يا وطن يا محتل يا شعب غلبوا النوم الليل عليكم هل والحكم في البوم كل الرجال سلموا وسنة بطولها تقوم تكشف ضلال كذبتكم وتحارب الفرعون